Welcome to Breaking Silence, a safe and brave space where we have real conversations about race in America. We'll go into our next throwback, which was from our colorblindness episode. And maybe the first one that we can start with, there was a point that we wanted to go deeper on, and that was this idea that when looking at colorblindness from the perspective of a person of color, that when it's happening like day to day, generally, well, I know you don't like it when I say generally, but there is a group of people who are people of color who feel like being colorblind in your day-to-day life is not the way to go. It's not a good thing. But in that episode, we also talk about how in like Hamilton, in like I think it was in the 90s, that version of Cinderella came out. Will Smith's casting as Genie in Aladdin, the Little Mermaid that's coming out, that in that aspect that colorblindness is praised. And so why is it like okay in one and not okay in the other? And so we kind of mentioned it and then moved on. And so we just want to take a few minutes to talk about that a little more deeply. So I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Well, I think it's a really tough question. Even like when I try to like go through it myself and answer it, it's like, oh, you're right. That does seem kind of like, I don't know, not hypocritical, but it's like, okay, well, what are you saying? Either you want it or you don't want it, you know? And we do celebrate the colorblind casting in Hamilton, and you know, Black people were loving it when Halle Bailey got cast as Ariel in The Little Mermaid. Like, yes, like we're ready for it. So is it okay to be colorblind when it comes to stories? You know, and some people will say, okay, cartoons, invented stories, but Hamilton was not a cartoon. So I think we can just put that all in one bucket for now and not get into the debate about a cartoon and Genie is blue and whatever. But yeah, it does seem a little bit like, oh, you're right. Like, why are we talking out of both sides of our mouth here? But what I'm thinking, like my first reason why it's okay to tell stories and to cast in a colorblind way, but not in day-to-day life, because in day-to-day life, when we say we're colorblind, what we're really saying is we're ignoring giant parts of a person. We're saying, don't bring this to the workplace. Don't bring this to the friendship. Don't bring this here. Everybody, let's treat everybody the same. Let's everybody be the same. And when we say the same, we mean more white. Like when we're assuming something about everybody having the same experience, we're assuming that everybody gets to have a more white experience. And that is problematic because, of course, you're burying parts of yourself. You're not authentic. And it's just not true. It's not fair to assume that everybody's having a same or similar experience when there's very serious, blatant, and just like constant ways that people are having differing experiences based on the color of their skin in this instance. And so to ignore that, I feel like is hurtful to a person. It's soul crushing. It leads to inauthentic relationships, and it doesn't help us move forward as a culture in getting better and at righting some of these wrongs. So that's why I think it's not okay in day to day, because that's what for me, that's what the premise of being colorblind is. Why it is okay in entertainment and telling these stories in, you know, Broadway and live action movies is because that is good. This is my first thought. That is good for Black people. It's good for Black people to get these roles, to showcase their talent, to get the exposure. And even though it might be not our story, Hamilton, it's still representation. It's still people of color being represented in positive, celebrated, amazing ways that historically they're not. They're kept in a little corner of a box somewhere else, a compartment that you wouldn't get to see that. So that's my first thought of why it's okay in one place and not okay in another.
Okay.
Are there any holes in that? in any of those thoughts?
No, I personally, I don't think so. When I brought it up in that episode, it wasn't so much that I felt like, oh my gosh, like you're being so hypocritical. I think it was more bringing to light the fact that we had kind of said this thing and then we said this other thing, and these two things may seem conflicting. So from my perspective, I think your explanation makes a lot of sense. Knowing there may be other people out there who feel like, oh, well, you just want like the best of all worlds. But I kind of feel like, who doesn't want the best of all worlds? I mean, I want to go out to dinner and have an appetizer and dessert. Like, why wouldn't I? So it makes sense to me that the reason it's different is because one has very negative connotations and the other one has very positive connotations or impacts. You know what I mean? I'm trying to think of like another example of something in life that is like that, where at first glance, it seems that it's counterintuitive or that you're talking out both sides of your mouth. But in the reality, like these two seemingly conflicting philosophies really ultimately support the same belief or values or outcomes that like it's okay here, but it's not there. And here's the reason why. So I think that makes a lot of sense the way that you explained it. When you were talking about how like Hamilton, it's this opportunity to showcase and display like talents of people of color in this very positive way. The other thing that I think I've had a shift in awareness or perspective as we've been having these conversations is seeing where there, and I'm not perfect at it, but seeing where there is or is not representation more often, or where there is representation, what the type of representation is. So for example, my husband and I were watching a sitcom, and there's a scene where the main character it's a comedy. He's like visiting his wife in prison, and his daughter comes along, but the daughter can't go with him because it's a conjugal visit. So she's literally like meandering around the perimeter of this women's prison. And there's 3 women who are like on the jogging path around the fence where she's like walking, and all 3 of them were people of color. And she's white. The girl is white. I'm like, we could have mixed it up. Like we could have had like a white person and a black person and an Asian person. Like we could have at least thrown, like one person in there, but that's something that probably a year ago I would have never even, like it never would have even dawned on me that that was problematic. But then we were watching it, and I even said something to my husband. I was like, the hell? Like, why does it have to be 3 people of color who are in prison and like the little white girl who's not in prison, so it's almost like an added layer, right? That because Hamilton is presenting people in this positive way versus casting people of color in roles that would be considered like they're like derelict, or shady people.
It is weird though to me, like to think about it deeper, like the representation, like you said, and what kind of representation, that's important. So I think about Hamilton, I think about like who was cast as which characters. I mean, I feel like all characters in Hamilton were celebrated, even if they were bad, right? But like there was like oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the character's name now, but a general who was like a coward, and he was cast as he was either white or he was lighter skinned, fair skinned, and I don't think it would have been a problem if he was black, because it didn't seem to matter. It seemed like there was an equal balance of flawed characters and not flawed characters. They're all flawed, but what I was thinking was, in Colorblindness Day to Day, I was saying that you don't bring your whole self to the relationship or to the meeting or whatever, and that's problematic. But if you think about Hamilton and the way like certain people were cast, it is weird that a black person was cast in the story of, let's say, Aaron Burr. Isn't it weird that it was, though? Like black people are cast as characters that were slave owners, maybe, or people of color, like Thomas Jefferson's character, for instance, was cast as a person of color. So isn't that weird though? Because even in that situation, they're not able to bring their whole selves to that performance. Like an actor draws upon their own personal experiences and feelings and emotions and interpretations so much. Of course, you do research and you kind of put yourself into other people's shoes, but you still bring a lot of your own self to that, which this might be a tangent, but that's why people are in such an uproar now about, like, Halle Berry was going to play a trans woman in an upcoming movie, but then she realized that was not, it should be a trans woman. But why should it be a trans woman? Because it, in a certain way, and I forget where I read this somewhere, in a certain way, it's like you're a minstrel if you don't, because you can't know this person's struggle and experiences and feelings and emotions. So it's a caricature versus a character kind of thing. So anyway, so I don't know. My point is, like, isn't it interesting that, yes, we celebrate Aaron Burr being played by a person of color in Hamilton, for instance, but he wasn't able to, as an actor, he wasn't able to bring his whole thoughts and experience and emotions to that role because he is Black, and he would have never done the things that he did or reacted the way he did. And so is that a case for not being colorblind as well? Because the people whose stories it are should be the type of people who play it. Like a trans woman should be played by a trans woman. A white person should be played by a white person. A Black person should be played by a Black person. And I don't know, I guess I'm being kind of devil's advocate here because I don't agree with it, but I just had that thought and I'm like, wait a minute, isn't it still inauthentic for an actor to play a role? And the same thing with all those cartoons now, that the white people who play a Black character or voice a Black character, they're stepping down, right? So why is that what we want? But
why is it stepping down?
They're stepping down from the role. They're saying, I quit.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Like they're not going to do it anymore.
Yeah, they're not going to do it because it should be voiced by a Black person because they bring. Gotcha. And there's other reasons. I'm sure it's not just that they bring that knowledge. It's representation. It's other reasons too. But like, I'm thinking now it is kind of hypocritical, right? If we're saying we want people to be authentic and we want trans people to play trans people and gay people to play gay people, why is it different with race, do you think?
Well, what came up for me when you were talking about that was, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'm just talking out loud here, but because to me, Hamilton was less about like an accurate historical depiction having to do with race and slavery, and it was more about his story and how somebody who came from like a very poor background, he immigrated here, like he really, what he accomplished in his lifetime, even with the flaws, that he brought, is kind of like what we're supposed to be about. Like America is supposed to be about, is equal opportunity, and that anyone can do anything, and like this is like our ideal. And so it was the story of this man with very humble beginnings who had this huge impact on our country that may or may not be recognized as much as the other founding fathers of our country are. And I will also say, like, I've not gone and like compared like real history to Hamilton and like done like a whole, analysis of how historically accurate it is. So please don't think that I'm taking all my history lessons from like a play. But to me, that was kind of like what that play was about versus it being a story about the history of slavery and race in America. So I don't know, like, if that makes a difference for people either. And like, is the fact that the casting is colorblind another added layer of like, this is what we're about? Because now it is this group of people who have historically been marginalized being showcased and celebrated and recognized for their talents. I don't know. But that's
So
what came up with me, was just like, does the core content make a difference? Like, if that role that Halle Berry was going to play about that transgender person, if it was just like a transgender person living their life, and really the point of the story was about, I don't know, coming of age, and they're like a secondary character, would it be as big a deal? But if the story is really about the experience of a transgender person, and it's core and central to what the theme of that story is, does that make a bigger difference?
that's what I was gonna say. If the person was like a side character, or it wasn't about a transgender experience, would it be different? I think people would still say, "Hey, no, this needs to be played by a transgender person." I think people would still be up in arms about it because some of these cartoons too. And honestly, I don't watch these cartoons that have been in the news recently for these things, but I know that the cartoons are not about like class, race. They're not about that, and they're still being, it's still hot. It's still a hot topic. So I think it still would be the same. But maybe it goes back to some of the other reasons for this, and it's not just about what the actor brings or does not bring. Maybe there's more reasons why it's important. But it does seem to me, it seems weird suddenly, like, oh, okay, well, but maybe, and also maybe the transgender example is not the best example for some reason. Let me know if it's not, if anybody has any thoughts on it. But that's what came to my mind. Like, people who have these experiences bring these experiences to the role, and so that's what we want to see. We want to see this actor bring this to life based on how they uniquely can play it. And does race play a part in that? And if so, would we want colorblind casting? But it seems to be a little bit racist to say, no, we don't want colorblind casting. To me, it seems like, why not? Why can't a Black singer audition for a role was written for a white character? Like, why not?
And at the same time, we're saying that a white singer cannot cast for a role that's supposed to be Black.
We are saying that. Okay, so that might be a moment of clarity. So we are saying that because my fiance does this all the time. Like, when we have conversations, this is how we like go back and forth. Like, if I say I want to look at only Black vendors for my wedding, and he says, well, if I said I only want to look for white vendors for my wedding, that would be racist. Yes, sir, it would. So maybe it's the same thing here. We're saying, yes, a person of color can play a character written for a white person, but a white person can't play a person of color because we've got catching up to do. It's about catching up. And historically, there hasn't been any roles for Black people written for Black people. So if there's going to be roles written for people of color, damn it, put these people of color in them, or else we're just going to continue. That's how it's been. It's been people of, blackface or whatever. I don't know, so somebody that's really tan getting to play Pocahontas or whatever. Like, why not put the people that this was written for, these marginalized, underrepresented people, give them the chance in the spotlight? Let's increase representation, because there's so many more benefits than the other. How does that make you feel?
I think, like, this is where, and this actually kind of leads into our third point, which was, so maybe I'll just introduce it now and we can continue the conversation, like evolution. But the third point that we're going to do the throwback to is this idea of the danger that being color conscious could lead inadvertently to white pride, and kind of why, like, breaking down a little bit about like Black pride versus white pride and what all that looks like.